This is Jiddu Krishnamurti's 7th public talk in Saanen, 1961.
I think it will be necessary to understand what is negative thinking and positive thinking. I am using those two words, negative and positive, not in the opposing senses. Most of us think positively. That is, accumulate, add, and when it is convenient or profitable, subtract. Positive thinking is imitative, conformative, adjusting itself to the pattern of society or to what it desires. And with that positive thinking, most of us are satisfied. To me, such positive thinking leads nowhere. Now, negative thinking is not the opposite of positive thinking. It's quite a different state, quite a different process. And I think one has to understand that clearly before we go any further. That negative thinking is not the opposite of positive thinking. Negative thinking is to denude the mind totally. Negative thinking is to make the brain, which is the repository of reactions, quiet. You know, most of our brain is very active, constantly reacting, and it must react. Otherwise it ceases, it dies. And in its reaction it creates positive processes, which it calls positive thinking, which are all defensive, mechanical. That is, if you have observed your own thinking, you will see it's very simple what I'm talking about. It's not very complicated. So the question is, primary question, is to be fully aware, the brain fully aware, sensitive, active, without reacting. And therefore, it is necessary to think negatively. Perhaps we shall discuss this at the end of my talk, what it involves. But if you grasp this, you will see that negative thinking implies no effort. Whereas positive thinking does imply effort. Effort being conflict, in which is involved achievement, suppression, denial. Please watch your own minds in operation, your own brains at work. Don't merely listen to my words. Words have no meaning, no deep significance. Words are merely used to convey, to communicate. But if you remain at the verbal level, you can't go very far. So, as all of us, through education, through culture, through influence of society, religion and so on, are very active, have very active brains. But the totality of the mind is very dull. and to make the brain quiet and yet fully sensitive, active, but quiet, so that it doesn't cultivate any defenses, which is quite an arduous task if you have gone into it at all, to be totally, as a brain, tremendously active but quiet. Which involves, as I was saying, no effort. But for most of us, effort seems to be part of existence. We can't apparently live without effort. Effort to get up in the morning when one feels lazy. Effort to go to school, effort to go to the office. Effort to sustain a continued activity. Effort to love somebody. Our whole life, from the moment we are born to the moment we enter the grave, it is a series of efforts. Effort means conflict. And there is no effort at all if you observe the thing as it is, the fact as it is. But we have never observed ourselves as it is, consciously or unconsciously, deeply. We always try to change, substitute, transform, suppress what we see in ourselves. All that implies conflict. And a mind and a brain that is in conflict is never quiet. And we need to think profoundly, to go very deeply, a very quiet brain. Not a dull brain, not a brain that has gone to sleep, not a brain that is drugged by belief, defense, but a brain that is intensely active, but quiet. It is this conflict that makes the totality of the mind dull. So we have to understand from the beginning, if we are to go into this question of meditation, enter profoundly into life, we have to understand conflict and effort. Because our effort is always to achieve, to become great, to be successful, to become something. And therefore there is conflict and frustration with its misery, despair, hope. So what is in conflict all the time becomes dull. Don't we know people who are in perpetual conflict, how dull they are? So, to encompass, to travel very far and very deep, one has to understand completely the question of conflict and effort. Effort, conflict is when there is positive thinking, and when there is negative thinking, which is the highest form of thinking, negative thinking, then there is no conflict, no effort. Now, All thinking is mechanical. All thinking is reaction. Thinking comes as a reaction from the background of experience, of memory. Thinking is mechanical. Thinking can never be free. It can be reasonable, sane, logical, depending on its background, on its education, on its conditioning. But thinking can never be free. I do not know if you have experimented with your own thinking. What is thinking? Not the dictionary meaning or a philosopher's idea, but if one observes thinking, is a reaction. Please follow this, because as one has to go into this question. I ask you a familiar question and you respond immediately, because you are familiar with that answer, with what you know. If one asks a more complicated question, there is a time lag, time interval, in which the brain is in operation, looking to memory to find the answer. And if one asks a still more complicated question, the time interval is longer. And during that time interval, the brain is seeking, searching, wanting to find out. And if one asks a question with which you are not familiar, you say, I don't know. But the state of I don't know is a state in which the brain is waiting to find an answer, either by looking through books, asking people, inquiring, but waiting for an answer. This whole process is thinking, which is quite simple. This is what we are all doing. Reaction to the knowledge, to the experience which you have gathered, from which you respond. Now, the state of mind that says, I don't know, and is waiting for an answer, is entirely different from a mind, from a brain which says, I do not know, and is not waiting for an answer. I hope you are following all this. Because if this is not clear, I'm afraid you won't be able to follow the next thing. Because we are still talking about meditation. We are still probing into this whole problem of the brain and the mind. And if one doesn't understand the root of all thought, to go beyond a thought is not possible. So there are two states. The brain that says, I do not know, and is expecting an answer, looking, searching, asking, to find an answer. And there is another state which is a state of not knowing. because there is no answer. Now, if one can keep that clear, then we can proceed. We can proceed and inquire into the question of attention and concentration.